The rain fell in steady sheets, soft yet relentless, drumming against black umbrellas and the polished wood of the casket. Claire Monroe stood motionless, her gloved hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. Around her, murmured condolences floated like ghosts, empty, rehearsed words she couldn't absorb. The air smelled of wet earth and lilies, heavy and suffocating. Beside her, Ethan stood still, his tall frame tense beneath the soaked fabric of his suit. He didn't cry. He hadn't since the night the hospital called. His silence hurt her more than any sob could. As the final prayers faded and the casket began its slow descent, Ethan leaned closer. His voice was barely a whisper, trembling, almost afraid of its own truth. "Mom," he said, eyes fixed on the grave. "There's something you should know about Dad before they bury him." The words sliced through the rain, freezing Claire's breath. For a moment, Claire thought she misheard him. The world seemed to tilt, rain blurring her vision, heart hammering against her ribs. "Not now," she whispered sharply, her tone breaking between command and plea. She turned away before he could continue, afraid that whatever he was about to say would shatter what little remained of her fragile composure. The pastor's voice resumed in the distance, solemn and tired, but Claire heard nothing. Her eyes darted across the crowd and caught a fleeting moment. A woman, maybe in her 30s, standing apart, holding a single white rose. Their eyes met for an instant before the woman looked away, guilt flickering across her face. Claire's stomach twisted. Something in the pastor's next words, "a faithful husband and devoted father," rang false. Even the heavens seemed to know. The rain grew heavier, pounding the casket, as if to drown out secrets buried deeper than the dead. That night the house was too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the old clock. Every sound felt louder in the emptiness he left behind. Claire sat in the dark living room, wrapped in his old sweater, the scent of him fading with each breath. Ethan was upstairs, door closed, refusing to talk. She tried to pray, but no words came, only Ethan's voice replaying in her head like a haunting echo. "There's something you should know about Dad before they bury him." What could he possibly mean? Her mind darted through possibilities, an affair, a debt, a secret life, but she pushed them away as quickly as they came. Grief was supposed to hurt. That was normal. But this crawling unease beneath her sorrow, was something else entirely. She looked toward the dark window, her reflection pale and hollow. What could possibly hurt more than losing him? She whispered. She was about to find out. Before the silence, before the rain-soaked funeral, there was once laughter in the Monroe house. Claire remembered Sunday breakfasts filled with the smell of pancakes and coffee, Mark's easy charm as he teased her about burning toast, and Ethan's shy smile from behind his cereal bowl. On the outside, they looked like the perfect suburban family. Mark, the admired financial consultant with a silver tongue and impeccable suits. Claire, the loving wife who left her nursing job to build a home. And Ethan, their quiet, well-behaved son. Friends envied their harmony, but behind closed doors, small fractures had begun to form. Mark's late-night client calls became routine. His explanations were smooth but empty. The bed grew colder, his touch rarer. Yet Claire smiled through it all, convincing herself it was stress, not distance. "When you've built your entire life on one person," she would later confess, "you can't afford to see the cracks." Ethan had grown up in that quiet tension, a child too observant for his age. He noticed the way his mother's laughter stopped before reaching her eyes, and how his father's warmth dimmed the moment he picked up his phone. Dinner conversations turned into rehearsed exchanges. "How was work?" "Fine." "How was school?" "Fine." Silence filled the spaces where love once lived. Claire tried to shield Ethan, keeping his world soft and stable. But children always sense the tremors adults try to hide. He learned early that truth was dangerous, that honesty only deepened the cracks in their fragile family. So he grew inward, polite and distant, a mirror of his father's restraint and his mother's endurance. To outsiders, Ethan was quiet but good, the perfect son. But behind his calm eyes brewed confusion and resentment. He was watching, always watching, as the illusion of his parents' love slowly unraveled. After the funeral, that illusion finally shattered. The house that once smelled of lavender and home-cooked meals now reeked of emptiness and unpaid bills. Claire sat at Mark's desk, sifting through documents that made no sense. Overdue taxes, credit card statements she'd never seen, and letters addressed to a woman named Rachel Turner. Each envelope felt like a betrayal wrapped in paper. The numbers didn't add up, and neither did the life she thought she knew. Even the photographs on the walls mocked her, frozen smiles from birthdays and vacations that suddenly felt staged, artificial. Ethan avoided her questions, but she saw the same fear in his eyes she once carried herself. The perfect husband, the perfect father, none of it was real. For the first time in 20 years, Claire looked around her home and realized she didn't recognize it. The walls whispered lies, and every corner held a secret. It happened late one night, the kind of silence that feels too heavy to be natural. Claire sat on the couch surrounded by unopened mail, her mind numb from numbers and memories that made no sense. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He didn't speak at first. When he finally did, his voice was low but unshakable. "Mom, Dad wasn't who you thought he was." The words hung in the air like smoke. Claire blinked, uncomprehending, a fragile smile forming as if denial could make the moment disappear. But Ethan went on, each sentence cutting deeper. "He had another life, Mom, another woman, and another kid." The room seemed to tilt. Claire's heart slammed against her chest. She shook her head violently. "No, stop." But Ethan didn't. He pulled out Mark's phone, the messages, the photos, the child's drawing that read Daddy Mark in crayon. Proof undeniable. Claire's body moved before her mind could catch up. She screamed, throwing the nearest thing, a vase, against the wall. The shattering glass echoed through the house, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out Ethan's words. "He lied to us, Mom," he said quietly, standing still while she unraveled. Her breath came in short gasps as she grabbed the phone, scrolling through the evidence, the woman's name, the messages full of tenderness she hadn't received in years, the pictures of Mark holding a little girl with the same eyes as Ethan's. Her stomach twisted with nausea. No, he wouldn't. Not him. But every photo, every word said otherwise. When she looked up, her son wasn't a boy anymore. He was the witness to a truth she'd been too blind to see. "When?" she asked, voice breaking. Ethan's answer was a whisper that felt like a knife. "I've known for a year." Her knees gave out, and she sank onto the floor, clutching the phone as if breaking it could erase what she'd seen. "A year?" she whispered. "You knew, and you didn't tell me?" The betrayal in her tone made Ethan flinch, but he didn't look away. "He begged me not to, Mom. He said he was fixing it. He said he still loved you." His voice cracked on the last word. Claire felt fury surge through her, not just for Mark's deceit, but for the burden he'd placed on their son. "You shouldn't have carried that," she said through tears. "You were just a kid." Ethan's eyes glistened, a storm of anger and guilt behind them. "Long enough," he said, voice trembling, "to hate him for it." The silence that followed was unbearable. For the first time, Claire realized grief wasn't her only enemy. It was betrayal, wearing the face of everyone she loved. The days that followed blurred into a storm of discovery and disbelief. Claire thought she had already lost everything, but the truth kept finding new ways to wound her. Rachel Turner. The name appeared first on a bank statement, then on an apartment lease in the city, both signed by Mark Turner. She found photos in an old email account, smiling faces in a sunlit park, Mark holding a little girl with pigtails. Sophie. 6 years old, innocent, bright-eyed, and impossibly familiar. Claire's chest tightened as she realized her husband hadn't just cheated. He had built another family, another life. Her therapist told her to breathe through the rage, but it felt like inhaling fire. Every corner of the house whispered betrayal. His cologne, his handwriting, the sound of his laughter in her memory. She wasn't mourning a man anymore. She was mourning a lie that had worn her husband's face. Ethan, once quiet and contained, began to unravel. His grades plummeted, teachers called, and he stopped answering Claire's questions with anything but anger. She found out he'd gotten into fights at school, one of them defending his father's name, another mocking it. Grief had curdled into rage. One night, the tension finally exploded. Ethan stood in the kitchen, fists trembling, voice shaking with bitterness. "You were so busy pretending to be the perfect wife, you didn't even see him lying to you." The words hit harder than any blow. Claire's hand moved before she realized, a sharp slap that cracked through the air. Ethan's stunned silence was worse than his anger, his eyes filled with disbelief, not at the pain, but at the betrayal. Claire froze, tears welling as she whispered, "I'm sorry," but the damage was done. Between them stretched the same emptiness Mark had left behind, cold, echoing, and endless. Just when Claire thought things couldn't get worse, Rachel Turner called. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, the voice of someone who had no shame left to hide. "I'm contacting you regarding Mark's estate," she said. "Sophie has rights. We'll be pursuing them legally." Claire's blood ran cold. Her husband's mistress wasn't just a ghost from the past. She was now a legal adversary. The lawyers arrived, polite but detached, reducing her pain to numbers, signatures, and assets. Mark's debts, hidden accounts, and Sophie's inheritance tangled into a nightmare that consumed every waking hour. At night, Claire would sit alone, staring at the empty side of the bed, wondering who her husband had really been. Love, trust, motherhood. Everything she'd built her identity on had been stripped away. The cruelest truth settled in. Even in death, Mark still controlled their lives, leaving destruction she would spend years trying to clean up. The storm outside matched the one inside Claire's chest when she discovered Ethan was gone. His room was empty, his phone off, a note scrawled with trembling handwriting. "I need to know who he really was." Panic seized her as she drove through the rain, streets blurring under the wiper's desperate rhythm. When she finally reached Rachel Turner's address, her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the keys. The door opened before she could knock, and there he was. Ethan sat on the living room floor, a toy car in his hand, playing with a little girl who looked like a reflection of his childhood. Sophie. His eyes were red, his expression hollow. Rachel stood nearby, guarded but not cruel. "He just wanted to meet her," she said softly. For a long moment, Claire couldn't speak. Seeing her son beside the child who represented everything she'd lost tore something deep within her. When words finally came, they came as accusations. "How could you?" Claire snapped, tears spilling. "You destroyed my family." Rachel didn't fight back. Instead, she lowered her gaze, her voice trembling with unexpected sincerity. "You think I didn't lose too? He promised he'd leave you, yes, but he never did. He came here the night before he died." Claire froze. The air seemed to vanish. Rachel's next words came softly, as if she too struggled to believe them. "He said it was over. He said he'd told you everything and was going home, to make things right." Claire's breath caught. That night, the one before the accident, Mark had called her, asked if they could talk. She'd ignored the call, too angry, too tired. Now the truth crashed over her. He had been coming home to confess, to repair what he'd broken. But fate had ended his redemption halfway down a rain-slicked road. The weight of it crushed her. Claire sank to her knees, sobs breaking through years of silence and rage. All the anger, the betrayal, the guilt, it all unraveled in that single devastating truth. Ethan rushed to her side, arms wrapping around her for the first time since the funeral. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered, his own tears falling. She held him tightly, realizing that in losing Mark, they had nearly lost each other too. Rachel stood quietly in the doorway, watching the fractured pieces of two families finally find fragile understanding. For the first time, Claire didn't see Rachel as an enemy, just another woman trapped in the orbit of the same broken man. The rain eased outside, the storm fading. Claire's voice trembled as she said, "No more lies, not anymore." And in that moment, the illusion that had defined their lives finally dissolved, leaving only painful, necessary truth. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the sharp edges of grief began to dull. The house that once felt like a shrine to Mark's memory now felt like a prison, filled with echoes of laughter that no longer belonged to her. One morning, Claire packed the last box, sealed it shut, and left the keys on the counter. Selling the house wasn't just a financial decision, it was an act of liberation. She moved into a small apartment near the hospital where she'd returned to work as a nurse. The scent of antiseptic and the quiet hum of the ward reminded her that she still had purpose, still had something to give. Every patient she helped became a small victory against the emptiness Mark left behind. For the first time in years, she wasn't defined by being someone's wife. She was Claire Monroe, survivor, mother, and woman reclaiming her life. Healing didn't come in grand gestures. It came in quiet, deliberate choices. Claire began attending group therapy with Ethan, sitting in a circle of strangers who carried their own invisible wounds. There, she learned that strength wasn't about pretending to be fine. It was about showing up, even when broken. One afternoon, she met Rachel again, this time not as rivals, but as two women bound by the same betrayal. The conversation was calm, measured. "We were both lied to," Claire said, her voice steady. "The least I can do is end that cycle." Together, they divided Mark's remaining assets, not out of forgiveness, but out of integrity. When they parted, there were no apologies, no promises of friendship, only mutual understanding. As Claire left the cafe, she felt something she hadn't in months: peace. It wasn't closure, but it was the beginning of something better: acceptance. Ethan found his own way to heal. He began sketching again, portraits of his father, not as a saint or sinner, but as a man, flawed and human. Each line on the page seemed to release something he'd carried for too long. Claire often watched him draw in silence, a soft smile touching her lips. They were rebuilding, piece by fragile piece, learning to live with truth instead of illusion. On a quiet Sunday morning, as sunlight poured through their new home, Claire brewed coffee and felt, not joy exactly, but calm. She no longer needed answers from the past. The power was in her present, in choosing to live, to love her son, and to forgive herself. The ghosts were still there, but they no longer ruled her. Life wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And for Claire Monroe, after everything, that honesty was its own kind of freedom. The morning of the anniversary was bright, almost cruelly so. The kind of day that shouldn't belong to sorrow. The air carried the scent of wet grass and distant flowers as Claire and Ethan walked through the cemetery in silence. Time had softened the grief, but it hadn't erased it. When they reached Mark's grave, the world seemed to still. Claire knelt down, her fingers brushing over the carved letters of his name: Mark Monroe, beloved father and husband. The words felt both true and false, a contradiction etched in stone. She placed a single white rose at the base, its petals trembling in the breeze. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, she whispered, "You broke me, but you also made me see what love isn't." It wasn't bitterness anymore. It was release, a final letting go of everything she couldn't change. They stood together in silence, mother and son, no longer fragile but quietly strong. Ethan's hands were shoved into his jacket pockets, his eyes tracing the name on the gravestone. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, unsure, but honest. "Mom," he said, glancing at her, "I think Dad loved you. He just didn't know how." The simplicity of his words struck her deeper than any confession could. She turned to look at him, the boy who had carried too much pain, who was now learning to see the world through gentler eyes. "Then maybe that's what we'll do differently," she replied. Her voice didn't tremble this time. It carried warmth, forgiveness, and something close to hope. For the first time, she saw her husband not as a monster or a saint, just a flawed man. And in that understanding, she finally felt free. As they walked away, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling light across the gravestones. Claire felt its warmth on her face, a quiet promise of new beginnings. Behind them, the camera would linger. On the grave, the white rose, and the inscription that told the rest of the story. Beneath Mark's name, newly carved into the stone, were two words chosen by Claire: finally known. It was both an epitaph and a revelation, not for the man buried there, but for the truth that had finally come to light. Claire took Ethan's hand as they left the cemetery, their shadows stretching ahead of them, long and unbroken. They weren't the same people who had once lived in the illusion of perfection. They were survivors, Honest, scarred, but whole. And as they walked into the sunlight, it wasn't grief that followed them anymore, but peace.